Now that we've seen a couple of examples of poison cues, I want to do a deeper dive into how they are created. I'm going to begin by just briefly recapping an experiment that was done to highlight how important it is to understand poison cues and the far-reaching impact they have. This experiment was done by Dr. Jesus Rosales Ruiz and one of his graduate students at the Department of Behavior Analysis at the University of North Texas. Now, you can see the full discussion of this experiment that Dr. Rosales Ruiz presents at the National Autism Conference 2019 at the link below. And you're going to get this slide deck when you get the recording of this webinar, so don't feel like you have to jot this down quickly. You'll get this link in a couple of days if you're watching this live. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this because it's not my content to share. So I just want to recap the key points, and then if you want to follow the whole thing, you can watch it. It's almost 3 hours long, and Dr. Rosales Ruiz does a really lovely job of sharing all of his fascinating research. So I encourage you to look into that if you really want to get nerdy about all of this. But basically, in a nutshell, what the experiment is all about is he set up two different conditions with the same dog, teaching the same behavior, using two different cues. The behavior was a recall, just having the dog come to the handler. And the one cue, which they used the word VEN, was taught with 100% positive reinforcement. It was shaped, the dog was not on leash or anything, completely free to do what the dog wanted, and 100% shaped and reinforced with positive reinforcement. The second recall was taught using the word punir, which means punish in French, and that was used with a combination of negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. This dog was it was the same dog, taught both cues, and they for the punir condition they put a harness and leash on the dog. This was the same harness and leash that the dog was used that you would wear out for walks and was still very happy to wear in other situations. But in this very specific training room that they used for the experiment, the dog would be put on a collar and leash, and then they would say the word punir and then immediately drag the dog over to them, which is such a common way that we teach our dogs to come to us. And maybe that's not how you train now. It isn't how I train now, but I certainly have done this in my training history, and it's a very, very common way for people to train their dogs. Just like pushing the bum down to get a sit, or you take their collar and pull them down to get them to lie down. All of these things, these are very, very common ways that we handle our dogs, and then we reinforce them with a cookie when they've done the right thing. So this is what he wanted to compare. What's the difference? What is the impact of doing these pretty common approaches to training where we're combining a negative reinforcer with a positive reinforcer, and what is the outcome of that versus just using 100% positive reinforcement? So the punir cue was the poisoned cue because the dog would get dragged over on a leash and given a cookie. Now, after they had been training for a while, and I forget how many training sessions they did, but they ended up doing quite a few. It was well over 100. But fairly early on into the experiment, both cues developed a reliable recall. The dog would come if you said VEN, and the dog would come if you said punir. The difference being that when they said VEN, the dog would come with tail up and ears up and happy and wagging and loose body and all the happy little body language that we love to see when we call our dogs when they come over to us. In contrast, the punir cue would similarly have a dog that would come promptly and efficiently, but with tail low, ears low, not cowering or anything, but not the happy body language that you saw with the VEN or 100% positive reinforcement based cue. So you really start to see the difference here, and you can clearly see in the behavior of the dog which one makes the dog feel good and which one makes the dog feel uncertain. So that's how the dog's approaching, sort of like, yeah, I'm coming. Is everything okay? Is kind of like his body language, what he's saying, versus when he was called with VEN, he was just like, I'm here. What do you want? Very different. Now, so, okay, fine. So we can see that difference, but why does this matter so much? Well, this matters so much because of what I talked about already, is how it can, this uncertainty, this anxiety that gets built into the cue starts to ripple out around everything else, around what's going on in that situation for the dog. And that's where we get ourselves into a lot of trouble. And we often have no idea that this is what's happened. And this is what's so critical, because what we end up doing is we end up misinterpreting what our dogs are doing. Think of that cute little golden retriever puppy in a crate not wanting to come out. We could so easily think that that dog is stubborn, or that dog has an attitude problem, or that dog is dumb. There are lots of things that we can label when we see that. But what's really going on is the dog is just uncertain and doesn't know how his behavior is going to affect the outcome, like what outcome he's going to get from his behavior. So what happens in the poison cue experiment is that once they have the two cues well taught to the dog, they start to use those cues as markers for other behaviors. So they want to use for example, to mark a backup. So the dog would back up a couple of steps and they would say ven, and that the ven in this case serves as a cue because it tells the dog, as a marker. So it would be like clicking, but instead of clicking, you say ven. And so you would say, the dog would take a step backwards, you would say ven, the dog would run forward and get a cookie. And the dog was like, oh, how can I get my person to say ven? I know, I'll back up again. And then the person says ven and the dog gets another cookie. So the dog is actively working, figuring out, problem solving, how to get the human to say the word ven, which is the same as they do to get us to click, or to use our other marker words, words that predict reinforcement. So this was very clear, and you could see very quickly that the word ven was serving as a click. Very happily, the dog was learning very fast and was doing all the things. Now, they did the exact same training using the word punir with very different effect. The dog did not work to get the human to say the word punir again. As a matter of fact, the dog started to avoid the things. So if the dog realized that backing up a couple of steps would get the human to say the word punir, the dog would stop backing up and would try something else and would go and do something else and would go sniff around the room. So this is what we see so often with our dogs when we're training. We will see a dog that will start to avoid the thing. They start doing this avoidance behavior. They might get silly. They might go sniffy. They might shut down. They might stop and scratch. They might suddenly be fascinated with a patch of grass. All these things. They may just simply wander around aimlessly, like they don't understand what we're asking them to do. And we might think our dog is dumb. We might think our dog has no drive. We might think our dog has some kind of anxiety disorder because of the environment or whatever. There are lots of ways, and sometimes some of that might be true. But generally speaking, if you see these types of behaviors, the first question that should come to mind going forward, now that you know this, is, do I have a poison cue here? Poison cues are everywhere. The most common example that we can probably all relate to is our own names. Yes, our names are a poison cue, because sometimes our name, when we hear our name, it's something good, and sometimes it's not necessarily so. Usually we can tell by the tone of voice of the person who is saying our name whether or not something good is going to come of that or not, but not always. Think about it. We do the same with our dogs. We may have a happy tone that we use and maybe a cranky tone with our dog. So for example, with Aoife, I will say, Aoife, if I'm happy to see her, but she might, not come. And then I might start to use a more frustrated tone of voice with her. Aoife, come on, Aoife, let's go. Come on, let's go. Right? So her name will become associated with good things and maybe not so good things. The mama getting cranky, for example. So her name can actually become a poison cue. And with a dog like Aoife, that's very, very possible. Now, if we think about it, if we were actually really smart trainers, I wish I was this good at it, but I'm not, I would actually have a different name for my dog when I'm cranky with them. Now, we actually do that typically in the reverse. So when I'm particularly feeling fond of my dogs and I'm happy, I tend to use nicknames. So with Aoife, her nickname is Bean. And I never say bean in an angry tone. I always use bean as a term of affection. So she always really perks up when I call her my little bean. Because that word hasn't been poisoned. If I was a really great trainer, I would have a specific nickname just for when I'm annoyed with her, and I would only ever use it then. But anyway, I digress. Another example of a poison cue would be your boss saying something like, "Can I see you in my office after lunch, please?" Think about it. How does that make you feel? Me? It kind of like, I mean, I'm self-employed now, but I certainly have worked for many people in the past. And in the past, if my boss asked me to meet them in their office, I wouldn't be entirely sure if that was a good thing or not. And most of the time it was, every now and then it wasn't. And that was enough to make that very much a poison cue, to the point that for me, bosses are poison cues in general, which is why I'm self-employed, because that just eliminates the entire aspect of having to deal with that level of anxiety in my life. Another example of a poison cue is simply reaching for your dog. I'm sure we've all done this, where they, especially with young puppies, we reach for them a lot, and then eventually the hand coming forward, which might be to be petting, but could also be to grab a collar, the hand becomes a poison cue because the dog is uncertain about the outcome. Let's take a look at just a couple of more quick examples so you have more visuals to go with as we continue our discussion.
Nunu, go to bed.
Lip lick. Quick blink. More licking. Avoidance. Looking away. Yawn. Sniffing. Panting. These are all signs of stress. Another example of the oh-so-common poison release out of a crate with a puppy cue that I mentioned earlier. Here's another example of that.
Come on, let's go. You want to go monkeys?
Stretching,
Do you
fidgeting,
want to come
lip
out?
licking,
Do you want to come out?
avoidance,
Does not want to come out.
whale-eye.
Does not want to come out. Does not want to come out. Oh, does not want to come out?
Worry ear, lick.
She does not want to come out. I do not. Come on, puppy. Come
More
on.
licking,
Does it not go?
dropping the head, backing up, moving away. So you can see all of these different ways that the dogs are displaying a level of discomfort and anxiety that comes just from the cue, which is a poison cue. These are not stubborn dogs. These are not dumb dogs. These are confused and anxious dogs. So how are we creating these poison cues? Because we've all done them. Okay. There are 3 ways that we end up with poison cues. The first one is anytime we use an aversive while using a positive reinforcement training program, whether or not it's intentional. So typically it's unintentional. If we are positive reinforcement-based trainers, we will be doing our best to just reinforce using our reinforcers and not use any aversives intentionally, but we still do it by accident. And we may not even be aware of it a lot of the time. So things like putting pressure on the dog, so I showed you the example of Aoife. The other dogs behind me, eyeballing her as she came through the door, I didn't even realize they were there, poisoned her recall into the house. So that's a strong aversive for her that I wasn't even aware of in the environment. Reaching for a collar, having a dog on leash, especially if they're pressure sensitive, or even just having a sense of restriction that they can't leave their situation, closing a door and locking them in a room if they're not really excited about being there. There's so many different ways that our dogs can feel a certain level of aversiveness to the training setting or to the experience of training that we are not aware of. That's why I spent so much time going over all the different possible cues in our dog's experience that we need to become aware of, because when we want to try and fix a poison cue, we need to figure out what exactly is contributing to the poisoning. Okay, another way that we end up with poison cues is when we intentionally mix positive and negative reinforcement together in our training. This is something that we tend to do a lot as well. For example, we will use positive reinforcement for correct behavior and a no reward marker for mistakes. Agility people, pay attention to this one. Stop using no reward markers. They are not helpful. They create poisoned cues in your dog. For example, this is something that I see often. We start to train weave pulls. The dog goes through a couple of weaves and pops out. They get a no reward marker saying, wrong or oops, or we try and do it, let's do it in a cheerful tone. It doesn't matter. How we express the no reward marker doesn't matter. We can do it as cheerfully as we want. If it is a predictor that the dog is not getting reinforcement, that is going to take on a negative conditioned emotional response for our dog, and that is going to bleed into the entire training program that we are doing. So if you're using a no reward marker to teach your weave pulls, what you might start to see is a dog who's going to start to get slow, who's going to start to lose their enthusiasm for the weave pulls. They're going to start to, pop out more often. They might avoid them altogether. You might send to the weaves and the dog will start sniffing the ground. All of these things are often an indication that you have a poison cue. So think about it. Have you used intentionally or not a no reward marker when you're training your weave pulls? That's just an example, but we see these sorts of things all the time, particularly in agility. I don't see it that often necessarily in other sports where we use no reward markers that intentionally, but we use it all the time unintentionally. And so it's something to pay attention to. The third way that we create poison cues is when we teach a behavior using an aversive, and then we reinforce it positively after it has been performed. This is probably less likely if you're watching this webinar. You're probably here because you're already dedicated to positive reinforcement approaches to your training. So this may not be something that you do in your current training approach, but maybe it is. Or maybe you have done it in the past and now you have a cue that has been taught that way in your current dog and you're wondering what to do about it, or why it's not such a great behavior. It's not the behavior you want. It's because it was taught this way. So for example, the pushing the bum down for a sit. So you push the bum down, which will be aversive to most dogs, even if they don't really show it. It's still not a super great thing for them. And then we give them a cookie. Bum down, cookie. Bum down, cookie. So that's a very typical way to teach a dog to sit, and the dog will learn to sit, but you're going to end up with a poison cue there. So you're going to end up with a slow sit, a reluctant sit, droopy-eared sit, walleye, lip licking, all of those things that we saw in the examples just now in the videos of dogs that are showing some anxiety response around the cue that they've been asked to do. So to summarize, if you have a dog showing any of these signs of stressing low, typically, sometimes they'll stress high. Sometimes the dog will show more what we consider high arousal behaviors, although in both cases it's technically high arousal. But we usually will see stress low behaviors associated with a poison cue. So that is your first big red flag. If you see these stress low behaviors, immediately stop and question, is something poisoning your cue? So these stress low behaviors, again, will be avoidance. You'll see slow responses, which we refer to technically as increased latency. You will have low accuracy, so your dog isn't going to be performing very well. They may sniff, they may scratch, they may shake out their coats, they may wander off, they may find everything and anything more interesting than working with you, they may freeze up. You'll see lip licking. That's a real, the lip licking is something, just watch for that because they do it very quickly, but you'll see it all the time. That's a very, very good indicator that your dog is feeling a little uncomfortable. Whale eye, that's when you see the whites of their eyes. Any type of looking away, or generally just not engaging with you fully with a big, happy body language and bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. So if you're not seeing that when you give them a cue, question whether or not maybe you have a poison cue. In terms of the high arousal behaviors, you might see a dog who gets silly, does avoidance. You saw that little puppy in the crate who was sort of wagging his tail and being all cute and everything. That's also avoidance behavior. Sometimes they can get zoomy, Some of them will start barking and biting. Those can also be signs of poison cues. But more typically, you're going to see the freeze, flight types of behaviors because they just want to avoid the whole situation. And again, why are poison cues so problematic? So the main reason that they are so problematic compared to using, for example, just strictly an aversive. If you're using an aversive, not that I recommend that you do, but I'm saying when you do, the dog knows that it's coming. The dog knows, oh man, if I do this, that bad thing's going to happen and I can avoid it. And so that's a lot clearer to the dog. If you're using strictly positive reinforcement, the dog knows, oh, if I do this, I can get that. So again, it's very clear to the dog. They know the outcome of their behavior. They know how they can control the environment around them. They can take charge of what's going to happen to them. They can recognize that, yes, I can do this thing and earn something nice, or yes, I can do this thing and avoid something unpleasant. So when you're using a very obvious positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer, it's very clear to the dog what the outcome is going to be. And that is going to give them a certain level of certainty and confidence. A poison cue is problematic because the dog cannot predict its outcome. It's not that the aversive might be that bad. It's the fact that there's an uncertainty that the dog is experiencing. And when we don't know what's going to happen when we do a behavior, it makes us very reluctant to do that behavior. That's why the poison cue is a problem. And even if you switch to 100% positive reinforcement and eliminate the aversive, the effect is still built into the cue and lingers. And that effect will spill over into other associated behaviors. Like we saw with the guide dog puppy in the car, who initially was happy to do a hand touch, and then quickly the hand touch became poisoned in that context as well. And if she had continued to feed him and try other things, probably food eating behavior in that context might have also gotten poisoned, and other things that she tried as well. So we can see, and the same with Aoife, me trying to get her through the door. At one point, I poisoned food. She wouldn't even take food from me. So you have to be really careful, because the effect, this uncertainty, this anxiety that comes with not knowing what the outcome is going to be will just start to spill over into everything. And that's what makes poison cues so potent and so problematic in our training. That, and the fact that they're often hard to identify because we don't realize that's what's going on, and then we misinterpret what our dogs are doing, and then we pick the wrong program to fix it, and then we get frustrated and we label our dogs as being, independent or stubborn or stupid or not a team player, and all of those things that I'm sure you've all heard people say about their dogs. Often it's because of how they have poison cues and they're not aware of it. All of what I just described were the results that came out of the poison cue study that I mentioned earlier. So again, if you want to really dive in deep, I encourage you to go and watch that presentation that I included the link for. But otherwise, here's just a summary of the reasons why you want to identify when you have a poison cue, and then work to fix it, and also work to avoid creating new ones in the future. And that's what we're going to talk about now. All right, so now you know you have a poison cue. You've figured out that what you're seeing in your dog is not stubbornness, is not a lack of understanding, but is in fact a poison cue. So what to do about it? Now, unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to solving the poison cue. Each context needs to be addressed on its own as a unique approach to fixing your problem. However, I can give you 3 different categories of approaches and some steps that you can explore to try and solve it. So the first one is, and this is the most simple and direct approach to fixing your poison cue, and the one that I recommend because it's the easiest and fastest path. And if you can do this, it should fix things very quickly. And that is to simply pick a new cue and train the behavior from scratch using positive methods only, and be very, very aware of what is aversive to your dog. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The second option is to tackle matching law hell, and I'll explain what that is as well in just a second. And the third approach is to use a consent protocol or a start button. So I'm going to just go into a little bit of detail about all three of these now to hopefully give you some tools that you can start working with on your own. So the first option is to retrain your cue using a new cue and positive methods only. Now, before you do that, it's really important to understand what aspect of your old cue has been poisoned. So, for example, go back to our sit, where I may have pushed down a bum a few times that the dog found was aversive and now is a little bit uncomfortable with the word sit. And the poisoning came from me reaching over and pushing the bum down. In that case, I can very easily retrain the word, the behavior of sitting using a different word. Maybe I'll pick the French one, assis. And I can just use that word, assis, and a clicker and some cookies and shape it. And then I can very quickly get a dog that is very happy to sit with the new cue. If I then later want to fade in the old cue again, that's also possible. We can back chain it, but you have to be careful with that. Let your dogs behave. I would get the assis, very, very solid, very, very happy. And then you could maybe back chain in your sit, assis, and then cookie. And if your assis is strong enough, and this is where we'll get into the matching law hell discussion in a second, so you'll understand a little bit more about that, you might be able to bring your old cue in. If you don't have to, I would say just scrap your old cue and never use it again. I know in some cases, for example, if you're competing in certain types of sports where you have very specific cues you have to use, you will need to bring them back into your training. But you can maybe use them with a different tone of voice. You can, you can pitch it differently. You can pronounce it differently. So, for example, if you have to say sit for your competition behavior, and your dog has an aversive reaction to the word sit because that was poisoned, you could maybe change how you say sit. So you could say sit or sit or something like that. That will have a completely different meaning to your dog than sit. And as long as that is agreeable to your competition guidelines, then that should solve your problem as well. Again, identify what is the poisoned part of your cue and work with that. So I use the example of it being the verbal word, but it may not be that. Your dog may be perfectly capable of sitting with the word sit and in a different context. So again, you need to suss this out. Is it my verbal that's the problem? Is it maybe the way I lean forward? Is it that I have a tendency to reach my hand towards my dog because I used to push their bum down? Maybe that's what the problem is, and I can just take that out of the picture and that will fix the problem. Is it that I need to not be standing in front of my dog when I'm training this behavior? Is it the training room that I'm in? What is it about the experience of that behavior, performing of that behavior, that has been poisoned for your dog? So this is where you have to do some sleuthing to figure that out. The next approach is to go to matching law hell. So what is matching law hell? Matching law is the approach to training that states that for every mistake you make, you have to balance it with doing something correctly to get to a neutral place. So if you have done 10 repetitions of your poisoned cue sit that we've talked about, you need to do 10 repetitions of it strictly with positive reinforcement to get yourself to a neutral position where the dog will feel neutral about the sit. Now, this is actually, I'm going to argue, not completely true because we have a strong negativity bias. So I'm going to say that the 1-to-1 ratio is not going to be sufficiently effective here. If you have 10 poisoned sits, cues, repetitions of the poisoned sit cue, you might need 100 positive ones to balance that out to get to the dog feeling neutral about this. So this is why I don't really recommend taking this approach, because it's a lot of work. And to be honest, at some level, your dog's never going to fully let go of that negativity. It's only you could do 100 good, positive reinforcement sits and then accidentally do the negative again, and you're going to wipe out all that hard work in one fell swoop. Now, think about this. This is my own personal example. As I mentioned earlier, I have a boss aversion. I feel quite anxious about having an authority figure having control over my ability to earn income for myself. And so I have lots of nervousness about this. Most of my boss experiences have been very positive, but I've had some strong negative ones in the past. It's been many, many years since that has happened. I have fantastic clients. I love everybody I work with, so on and so forth. But there's still a little tiny part of me that's always waiting for the other shoe to drop. So your dog will always have that little tiny part of them that is always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it can take a very, very long time for that to fade enough that you're going to get that happy, engaged, confident, relaxed behavior that you're looking for. So I do not recommend going to matching law hell. Sometimes it is the only option, but I think the first and the third option that I'm presenting you here should give you enough to work with that hopefully you won't have to. The third and final approach that I'm going to share with you today to solving your poison cue problem is to add consent or a start button into your training. Now, as I explained, the biggest problem with a poison cue is not the fact that sometimes we're using an aversive. It's the fact that the dog can't anticipate its outcome. The dog doesn't know if her behavior is going to result in something good or something yucky. And so that creates this anxiety and this reluctance to perform the behavior. So if we can give the dog back the control over the outcome, they're going to be very happy to perform the behavior. It's that need to feel confident in how things are going to turn out that we need to allow them to feel in order to get rid of the effect of the poison cue. This is how I solved my problem with Aoife, because I really couldn't change the protocol of, I couldn't change the cue, because the cue wasn't the word, it wasn't her name, it was the whole context. It's the doorway. It's coming into my house. I can't, even if, and that's so generalized with her. I mean, she does it in all doorways, in all places. It's not even going from outside to inside my house. It's within rooms in my house. It's just a generalized problem with doorways that she has developed because I didn't know how to handle it when I first started seeing it creeping up, when I first started seeing the reluctance, the avoidance, the lip licking, the whale eye, and things like that. And I just kept pressuring her, and then boom, now all doorways are poisoned. So I have developed a protocol to give her consent in order to have her be in charge of coming in the door and me closing it behind her. She likes the door open because that gives her an escape route. So I have given her the control over whether or not I close the door. So I'm going to leave you with this short video that shows you how I have given consent to Aoife, and hopefully that will inspire you to come up with solutions for your own poison cue if this is the option that works best for you. Okay, so here's Aoife coming in my front door. And what I do is I have her come in, and then I reinforce her by tossing. I don't have her come immediately to take a cookie from me, but I toss the cookie out the door. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm building up I'm reinforcing the behavior of coming through the door and having her practice that a bunch of times. Once she's willing to start coming in, then what I do, her consent for me to close the door is that she will come in, face me, and sit down. Until she does that, I will not close the door. Now, I'll reach towards the door. That's my asking her, is this okay? Can I do this? And she will say yes or she will say no. So let's take a look here. Here she comes. I give her a cookie. Throw her back out. She can come back in. So I'm not trying to lure her in because that just poisons the lure for her. Just marking her coming in. Now we do a hand touch, but I'm still reinforcing her back out there. I don't want to poison my hand touch. Not using it to get her to come in. It's just another behavior. There we go. So now I am moving back, and she's fully in the house. I'm creating more space for her to come in, letting her do a behavior she feels comfortable with, a hand touch. But I'm still letting her go back out the door. And I'm saying, can I see? There, she sat. She's saying, yes, you can close the door. I'm okay now. So this is early on in our training, so I didn't want to push that too much, so I let her go back out. Are you sure, Aoife? Are you really okay with me closing this door? Yes, there. See, that's her consent that I can close the door. So this is how I've taught her to come in. I've put her in charge of the door. And this took me a little while to figure out, to come up with as a solution, but it's working really, really well. And now, most of the time, she'll happily come in without me having to go through this whole protocol. But this is what I did for quite a while. And now, sometimes she still needs a little refresher. I have to be aware of the things that still poison her environment, like having the other dogs around. So I will only ask her to come in when they're not around. So again, I watch for all my any poison possibilities in the environment to minimize that as much as possible. And then I put her in charge of the door so that she can be confident of her outcome and be in control of the situation. Because it's the lack of control that creates the anxiety that leads to the stress low behaviors that we see from a poison cue. So that's what I really want you to take away from here. It's the lack of this ability to predict how things are going to turn out if they do the behavior that leads to the dog having problems associated with a poison cue. All right, so to wrap up, very briefly, in a nutshell, a poison cue is a cue that combines both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement in a way that leaves the dog uncertain of the outcome of their own behavior. This creates problems. This ambiguity, this lack of predictability is what creates the anxiety that leads to stress low behaviors that we may be observing in our dogs, that we may be misinterpreting, but that are coming from this inability to predict the outcome of what they're doing. And we solve this by giving them predictability, which sounds simple, but it can take a lot of work sometimes. And we create the predictability by either retraining the behavior with a new cue using 100% positive reinforcement methods. We can go to matching law hell and try to train things in a positive way enough times that we eventually erase the memory of the negative that was once present in the cue that we're using. Or we introduce a consent protocol where the dog can take charge of its outcome and feel in control and reclaim that predictability. And you'll see a much more confident, happy, engaged dog if you can achieve one of those three approaches and give them back the certainty in their life that they need. All right, I hope that helps. I hope that gives you some insight into what your dog might be doing. I hope it gives you some solutions that you can try. And now we are going to open up for the Q&A. So I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.